October. You know what that means.
Almighty's back. He's the man behind the mask. And he's out of control. He's back.
Welcome back, Pomegranate Nation. It's that time of the year when ghosts and goblins reign, when fear cracks the whip, and when gamers everywhere hunger for the visceral thrills of a good horror game. I've compiled my list of top 10 horror games that I absolutely love, and that serve up a terrifically scary experience. I was originally going to do a top 5, but then I realized there were other games that I absolutely had to talk about, and then even after whittling my list down to 10, I realized there were still games I wanted to talk about. So I thought, what the hell? Let's do some honorable mentions. So, without further ado, the honorable mentions. Harvester. Let's get this out of the way. Harvester is not a good game by any stretch. The acting is dreadful, the graphics were out of date upon release, the gameplay in the first part of the game is tedious, the gameplay in the second part is virtually unplayable. But what Harvester does have is buckets of disturbing content. There's a scene in which young children eat their mother alive, and another in which a baby's eye bursts out of its socket. And that's just for starters. The game was intended as a commentary on video game violence and censorship, which makes it an interesting artifact in the history of gaming, and nothing more. Alone in the Dark. No, not the 1992 classic, I'm talking the 2008 quasi-reboot that was supposed to be the grand return of the granddaddy of 3D survival horror games. Sadly, the gameplay is lacking, the graphics are lacking, the story is lacking, the driving mechanics are lacking, and the voice acting is unbelievably bad, even by video game standards. And yet, I've always enjoyed Alone in the Dark, mainly because there are glimpses here and there of the game it could have been. Sadly, the game effectively killed the franchise, so it's unlikely we'll ever get to see another truly great Alone in the Dark. And no, Illumination is not an Alone in the Dark game. The Seventh Guest and the 11th Hour. Though it may not have aged especially well, The Seventh Guest was genuinely jaw-dropping back in 1993. We had never seen anything like it before. Sure, today the puzzles are not very difficult, the video quality is really bad, and the acting is atrocious. But the game drips atmosphere. Wandering through the Stauff mansion was a joy, the soundtrack was wonderful, and Robert Hirschbeck's portrayal of Henry Stauff remains one of the finest villains in gaming. The 11th Hour took everything that worked in The Seventh Guest, improved the visuals and the story, but unfortunately suffered from bad writing, terrible acting, and some of the most frustrating AI puzzles ever designed. Alien Isolation. Alien Isolation is a one-trick pony, but that trick is incredible. The constant sense of dread, knowing the xenomorph is hunting you, will most likely find you, and will rip you to shreds when it does, makes the game an exercise in almost unbearable tension. However, that's it. There is simply not much to the game other than that. You wander around a spaceship and hide. I applaud the developers for making a lean game without all the excess crap that so many modern games have, but I can't help but feel the game is almost too lean. Until Dawn. High production values and a cool branching storyline make Until Dawn a great party game. It's a bit on the easy side, it lacks any real scares, but it is a terrific throwback to 1980s slasher films. And the voice acting is actually pretty good for a change. Get a couple of friends together, turn off the lights, maybe have a few beers, and you're in for a hell of a good time. Castlevania Symphony of the Night. The PS1 classic that created the Metroidvania style that would carry the franchise forward to this very day. Symphony of the Night is gothic gaming perfected. Spectacular graphics, all the classic movie monsters, and a ton of content make this one a game that has definitely aged well, and that soundtrack is incredible. The only thing that keeps it from making my list is it's really not that scary. It may be horror themed, but there really isn't much in the way of actual horror. And with those out of the way, here are now my top 10 horror games. Number 10, PT. One playthrough of PT shows just how stupid Konami is. A collaboration between designer Hideo Kojima and filmmaker Guillermo del Toro, PT was intended to give a taste of what their Silent Hills game would be like. But despite the massively positive response, Konami, in one of the most mind-boggling decisions ever, canceled Silent Hills after first firing Kojima and then removing PT from the PlayStation Store. While it is sad to think about what might have been, those of us who played PT know it is one of the scariest games ever released. The gameplay is simple enough. Walk around an endless loop of a narrow hallway until you somehow solve that loop's puzzles. Then you move on to the next loop, solve a new set of puzzles. Each loop, however, contains strange and unsettling moments, radio messages, and oh yeah, a terrifying ghost named Lisa who will run up to you and scream in your face, forcing you to restart the loop. The visuals are outstanding, a true showcase for the Fox engine, and they were purportedly downgraded so as not to be too showy. The carefully doled out bits of story add to the growing horror, and those radio messages, man. When the DJ told me to turn around, I put the controller down and walked out of the room. I was done for the night. The puzzles are a sore spot, as even today, players cannot completely agree on how they actually completed some of them. But the game is incredible in how well it blends horror with Kojima's trademark design. Number 9, Resident Evil Remake. So how do you remake a seminal survival horror game and manage to please both fans of the original and newcomers? How about photorealistic pre-rendered backgrounds, realistic lighting effects, drastically improved voice acting, a slew of new puzzles? And that's just for good measure, so let's also throw in the terrifying Crimson Heads. Resident Evil Remake did everything right. It is an almost unparalleled achievement amongst remakes. Everything that made the original so good. The limited resources, the environmental claustrophobia, the creepy enemies, it's all still here, but it's been given a complete overhaul. The game is finally able to convey a constant sense of fear through its visuals and its gameplay. And the HD re-release from a few years ago still looks amazing, showing just how impressive Resident Evil Remake truly is. The only reason it's not higher on this list is because it's a remake of a game that already had a solid foundation. But that does not prevent it from being an incredible, incredible experience. Number 8, Yume Nikki. If you've ever wondered what the unfiltered mind of a psychologically tortured video game character looks like, Yume Nikki is the game for you. I'm not sure that Yume Nikki was intended to be a horror game per se, but the sheer amount of jump scares and disturbing content definitely give the game a horror atmosphere. So what do you do in the game? You wander around and collect stuff. Seriously, that's it. You play as a hikikomori named Madosuke, I think I said that right, and you travel around her dreams collecting artifacts that act as items. Once you've collected all the artifacts, you drop them off in the central nexus and watch the ending. You can actually play through the entire game and have absolutely no idea what is going on with any of it if you're not paying attention, as there is no plot or story to speak of. Rather, Yume Nikki relies entirely on repeated imagery and visual symbolism to convey what it's about to the player. And once things start to click, oh my god, phallic and uterine imagery, depictions of sexual assault, and at least one aborted fetus all make appearances. It all adds up to suggest that Madosuke was the victim of a sexual assault that may have resulted in an unwanted pregnancy. It reminds me quite a bit of the ending of Earthbound, in which you enter what you soon realize is a uterus to do battle with an alien fetus, essentially performing an abortion. And that's no surprise given the number of references to the Mother series in Yume Nikki. The game also features a huge number of Easter eggs, images and scenes that aren't necessary to anything really, but do add to the weird and creepy atmosphere. The gameplay can be tedious, but it is an experience, one that I highly recommend gamers try at least once. Just brace yourself for the ending, because it's a bit of a bummer. Number 7, System Shock 2. Before BioShock, there was System Shock, one of the best first-person shooters, and also one of the scariest games of all time. Even with its outdated graphics, System Shock 2 manages to convey a near constant sense of panic, as you have to juggle relentless enemies that can wipe you out with no effort, a complex RPG-style inventory and upgrade system, and an insane AI named Shodan. Shodan reminds me a bit of Am in I Have No Mouth and I Must Scream, but whereas Am was overly malicious, Shodan just plain crazy. A malfunctioning AI system that is far more unpredictable. The mid-game twist may not seem like much today, since most gamers going into the game for the first time will undoubtedly have already heard about it, but try to imagine what it was like back in 1999 to get to that point and to have everything that you've been through pulled out from beneath you. It was a shock to the system. System Shock 2 has lost none of its power to scare gamers at all, and Shodan remains one of the most frightening antagonists in gaming. Do yourself a favor and plug in the headphones, turn off the god-awful music, and brace for a sci-fi tinged nightmare. Number 6, Bloodborne. Dark Souls meets H.P. Lovecraft with guns. At first glance, Bloodborne does seem little more than Dark Souls with a Victorian Gothic aesthetic, but the deeper you go, the more horrific the game becomes. You play as a hunter trying to rid the city of Yharnam from the scourge of the beast. But it quickly becomes apparent that things are way more complicated than just a bunch of monsters wandering around. The game's use of cryptic lore and story bits scattered here and there adds to the player's unease. Like the characters of a H.P. Lovecraft story, the player never fully understands what is happening, always feeling like the necessary information is just too big to fully comprehend. And like a H.P. Lovecraft story, the game penalizes players for learning too much by giving them insight into the world, a mechanic that causes certain enemies to not only change in appearance, but to also become more powerful. Bloodborne has some truly grotesque creature designs, especially the one reborn, and also the best Lovecraftian monster ever, Ebrietas. Seriously, she is worth braving Upper Cathedral Ward, which is the most unsettling area in the game. There are a number of good jump scares, but the moment that almost made me crap myself was when I turned around midway through the game and saw what was clinging to the side of Cathedral Ward. That really freaked me out, because it seems so unnatural, even in a game like this. Bloodborne's relentless atmosphere, Lovecraftian story, and gallons of blood make this one a horrific experience in all the right ways. Number 5, Rule of Rose. This is an odd one on the list because I really don't like playing the game. The controls are bad, the combat is bad, item discovery is a nightmare, inventory management is a nightmare, the backtracking is tedious, even saving your game is a pain in the ass. Why is it on this list at all, let alone in the top 5? The story and the atmosphere. For all it does wrong, Rule of Rose nails the story. Players take on the role of Jennifer, a young woman held captive by a group of deranged prepubescent schoolgirls. Like another game on this list, Rule of Rose is more about psychological horror, as Jennifer slowly pieces together what happened to these girls and why she's forced into these nightmarish locations. By the time it all comes together at the end, the story has become a harrowing tale of bullying, abuse, molestation, animal cruelty, and murder. The soundtrack, a minimalist blend of piano and strings, was wildly different from any other survival horror game of its time, and the flawed nature of the instruments really complements the story very well. As I said, Rule of Rose is not really that much fun to actually play, but anyone who likes horror games should at least watch a full playthrough. The Survival Horror Network on YouTube has a terrific playthrough that features just about everything in the game, minus 2 or 3 minor cutscenes. You're not missing much. Number 4, Siren. What do you get when you combine the atmosphere of Silent Hill with multiple playable characters and a non-linear narrative? Siren. Directed by the same man responsible for the first Silent Hill, Siren tells the story of a Japanese village afflicted by a terrible curse caused by the interruption of a religious ritual. The player controls 8 different characters as they attempt to escape the village while avoiding Shibito, the reanimated corpses of the villagers. The game is probably best known for its sight-jacking mechanic, which allows players to see through the eyes of enemies in the area, which in theory makes sneaking past enemies much easier. The game, however, is relentlessly difficult, due not only to the player's inability to ever actually kill enemies, but also to the unreasonable puzzles that require you to perform certain actions as one character in order to affect another character. Without a walkthrough, these puzzles become almost impossible to figure out, which makes the game much more difficult and much more frustrating than it needs to be. But the atmosphere and the story offer tension and fear in spades, and the choice to project actual faces onto character models rather than simply pre-rendering the faces adds to the unsettling atmosphere. Sound design is fantastic, maybe even better than the original Silent Hill. In spite of its difficulty, Siren is a terrific game that took real risks with its narrative structure and puzzle design. Even if it doesn't always work out, it's well worth a playthrough. Number 3, Eternal Darkness: Sanity's Requiem. Eternal Darkness features multiple playable characters spread out across 2,000 years, a gripping Lovecraft-inspired storyline involving ancient alien gods, and a well-crafted Resident Evil-style gameplay. All in all, solid game. What sets it apart, however, is the sanity meter. As the game goes on, your character begins to lose his sanity. When the sanity meter gets low enough, the game starts bugging out. It may appear to crash, your memory card may appear to be wiped, and your character may appear to lose her head. The first time this happens, it is a genuine freak-out moment. And there is enough variety in the effects that part of the fun of the game is going crazy. It's probably the best interpretation of Lovecraft's whole knowledge destroys your mind motif. Aside from that, though, the entire game is rock solid. There is plenty of variety in the characters and locations, and chapters are just long enough that they never wear out their welcome. If there ever was a game begging for an HD remake, Eternal Darkness is it. Number 2, Silent Hill 2 and Silent Hill 4: The Room. So I'm gonna cheat and talk about both. Why? Because choosing between them is impossible for me. Silent Hill 2 is a masterpiece of psychological horror, a terrifying descent into repressed memory featuring horrific monsters, a foreboding soundtrack, and one wicked gut punch of a twist. Everything in the game works, from the clunky combat to the wonky voice acting, because it all supports the characters and the story. All of the characters are severely traumatized, which means communication is not going to be something they can do with ease. The voice acting constantly sounds forced and just plain off, because these characters are trying and just barely managing to hold themselves together. The combat is wonky because James Sunderland is not a fighter, he's not a soldier. He's an everyman trying to survive a world he doesn't understand, can barely even rationalize. The constant fog and the impossible geometry of much of the world reflect James's confusion at receiving a letter from his wife who died 3 years earlier, and the grimy visuals reflect the steady corrosion of the characters' minds. For many, Silent Hill 2 is the pinnacle of the series. Silent Hill 4, on the other hand, is the most divisive game in the series, a game developed by Team Silent's B Team and featuring a number of changes to the series formula. And each of the changes is a love it or hate it proposition. The unkillable ghosts, the repeating levels, the very long escort mission, the limited inventory, and the titular apartment room serving as a central hub. Many players at the time really disliked these changes and went so far as to say the room is not a Silent Hill game. I disagree, because although the game is different, and not all the changes work perfectly, the game still feels like a Silent Hill game with its gameplay and atmosphere. Once again though, what the game nails is the story. Unlike most of the games, The Room is not about the protagonist, Henry Townsend, but rather the antagonist, Walter Sullivan. Henry is merely living within Walter's nightmare, but the story belongs to Walter. From the visual symbolism to the levels themselves, everything revolves around Walter and his quest. In fact, the story becomes quite tragic when you finally understand the full scope of what Walter is doing and why, which makes getting the very bad ending actually something you want to do at some point, and not something you simply screwed up and ended up with. Is one really better than the other? In my opinion, no. The gameplay may be stronger, more consistently good in Silent Hill 2, but The Room features a much stronger story, and I think many of the puzzles are much better. In short, you need to play both. If possible, track down a copy of the original PS2 release of Silent Hill 2. Avoid like the plague the HD collection, as it features many, many changes for the worse. Number 1. Fatal Frame 2 Crimson Butterfly. I don't care how many times I play it, or how well I know what's coming. Fatal Frame 2 always scares the crap out of me. On paper, the game is nothing remarkable. Simple story about twin girls lost in a haunted village who must find a way of lifting the curse in order to escape. The gameplay consists of defeating enemies and collecting items to open doors. The soundtrack consists of long stretches of silence punctuated by footsteps, followed by bursts of droning noise. But what makes this number 1 is how well done everything is. Combat is so much fun because you have to maneuver into position so as not to be harmed. You then raise your camera, you aim, and then you time your attack to do the most damage while still repelling the enemies. Environments are dark and oppressively claustrophobic. The sound design is pitch perfect at every turn. The backstory of the village is both tragic and horrifying. There is a nice variety to the enemy types, and the jump scares are the best in gaming. Every Halloween I play Fatal Frame 2 and it never gets old. It is old school survival horror, so modern players may not like the fixed camera angles, the awkward controls, but if you give it a chance, Fatal Frame 2 will scare the crap out of you, and you will love it. And those are my top 10 horror games. Stay tuned this Halloween season for a few other top 5s and maybe some top 10s. I'll see you then. Thank you for watching. Hey everybody, before you go, I wanted to let you know about a contest I'm running. I was recently given a coupon for a free copy of the audiobook for Bob by Tegan Moss, featuring the voice talents of yours truly. I had a lot of fun working on this project. It's a great book, and the audiobook is really cool. I got to do all kinds of different voices, including a very over-the-top Russian accent. If you would like to be entered into the drawing for this free copy of the Bob audiobook, all you have to do is send me an email with your name and your favorite scary movie. Send it to pomegranateriradio@gmail.com. The winner, along with the viewer-chosen list of favorite scary movies, will be announced on the Halloween episode. So get those entries in no later than October 30th. Thank you very much.
Pomegranate.